Hi everyone, I'm Sarah McDonald. I'm a Research Officer for New South Wales Department of Primary Industries based at the Trangie Research Station. And today I've just been asked to talk on the diversity and management of pastures in Western New South Wales rangelands. So I thought I'd start with just talking about what diversity means and why this matters, and a few different measures available to assess diversity in your pastures. And then I'll go on just to touch on a few details about impacts of grazing management and different strategies that we can use to manipulate that pasture composition. So diversity refers to the variety of plant species that exist within an area, and this can be scale dependent. So at finer scales, we can consider the genetic or species diversity within an area. At larger scales, we might consider functional groups or types, different communities, or even different ecoregions at larger scales. And diversity in agricultural landscapes is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it can increase resilience to climate change and other stresses such as drought or biosecurity and disease risks, as each species is able to withstand different stresses. Different species can perform different roles in that pasture. For example, annual species may be able to respond quickly to small rainfall events. Perennial species may be able to persist longer into dry times and provide that important ground cover. And even unpalatable species, during periods of drought, they may provide a feed resource or be available to protect the soil surface where other species may have been grazed out. Livestock have been shown to perform better where a variety of species are present, as they are able to selectively graze to meet their nutritional requirements. Especially in drier environments, diversity has been linked with increased production and therefore productivity and profitability of livestock enterprises. And not least, diversity is important for habitat and ecosystem health, as it provides important food and habitat for insects and other fauna, as well as providing ground cover to reduce soil erosion, increase soil carbon sequestration and landscape function, for example. So when we're out in our paddocks, there are many different elements of diversity that we can consider, and I'll run through a couple of these today. The first is species richness, which is essentially talking about the number of species that exist within an area. So this might be, for example, just a 1 by 1 metre quadrat or a 20 by 20 metre area through to the entire paddock. So the scale is important and dependent on what you're interested in. As an example, we have an area on the left on this box here, where we can see about 10 or 11 different types of species present within that area. On the right, we have the same number of plants, the same size area, but we can see there's only 2 different types of plants in that area, and so you might consider that to be less diverse. Although, as I mentioned, it is scale dependent, and so at smaller scales, we may find that there is actually no difference in that species richness or composition, and so it's important to keep this in mind when assessing diversity in your pasture. A second measure of diversity is species evenness, which refers to the relative abundance of those different species. And so on the bottom left, we can see that this area has about 5 different species, and each species is present in about relatively the same abundance. And so we can see about 3 of each of those. This is compared to the area on the right, where we can see the same species are present, the same number of plants are present, but the composition is dominated by that leafy black herb. And there are measures of diversity that can combine both the richness and the evenness measures into its own diversity index, but I won't get into that today. So next we have beta diversity, and depending on the context of this might also be referred to as pattern diversity or turnover, and it essentially refers to the change in diversity between areas or with an increasing size of the area. And so, for example, on the left we can see 3 different areas or boxes. In each box we see 5 species, but as we move from one box to the other, we see that each box contains relatively the same composition of species. This is in comparison to those 3 boxes on the right, where each box has almost an entirely new suite of species present, and so we might consider this to have a greater turnover or beta diversity than that paddock on the left. The last measure of diversity I'll touch on today is functional diversity, which refers to the variety of different functional types or traits of plants that exist within an area. And so an example of some of these traits which you might want to consider is the presence of different life histories of plants within the area, for example, annual or perennial or biennial species, the variety of life forms that are present, so whether they be trees, shrubs, forbs or grasses, and these life histories and life forms are often combined into common measures such as perennial grasses or annual forbs. We can look at the growth habit of species that are there, so whether they're erect or prostrate or climbing species, whether the species are short or tall, the varying heights of the species, the palatability of those species, and many other measures. For example, you may want to consider the nitrogen fixating species or deep-rooted species that are present in the pasture. So as you'd be aware, livestock and other herbivores can impact on the pasture by three key mechanisms. The first is through consumption of that plant material, which directly reduces the biomass, but also indirectly changes that species composition through selective grazing. We've got trampling, which disturbs the soil surface and compacts the soil, and also aids nutrient cycling as litter and live plant material is pressed into the soil. And thirdly, we've got defecation, which returns nutrients to the soil, but also shifts nutrients around that landscape. So I'll talk on some of the impacts and management of grazing on the pasture production and diversity. But it's important with this to remember that above all, in arid and semi-arid rangeland environments, climate is going to have the biggest impact on what we see on the ground. Disregarding this and looking at what we can manage, grazing intensity is our biggest factor that we've got at hand to be able to manage that diversity of pastures. This is followed to a smaller extent, but still as an additional benefit, by grazing strategy. So as you'd expect, as grazing intensity increases, we generally see a reduction in that plant diversity. And that's also associated with a reduction in plant biomass, ground cover, a degradation of the soil structure, a change in the composition of the species present, and also a loss of those grazing sensitive species. Now this change isn't always linear, as I've depicted. In some environments or under some conditions, we may see that in low or moderate intensity grazing situations, there's actually an increase in diversity, as those species which are favoured under grazing increase without that loss of those grazing sensitive species. This is obviously situation dependent. In terms of the characteristics that we see in plants as we increase in the grazing intensity, we generally see a loss of those tall perennial erect and tussocky type of species with large leaves, and an increase in the short, prostrate and annual type species with smaller leaves and a higher regrowth potential, or with grazing repellent traits such as spines. And you can see these changes as we drive closer to water points, or if you have one paddock that's been grazed at a higher stocking rate to another over the long term, you may notice these characteristics of species are more abundant. In terms of the effect of grazing strategy, the scientific research on this is a bit mixed. Global reviews have shown that there is some evidence that grazing for short periods with long rest can increase ground cover and production per hectare, but not necessarily production per head or a change in diversity. And many of these reviews show no differences at all between grazing systems. This is in contrast to a lot of the anecdotal evidence from producers who do promote a lot of benefits from these systems. And this disconnect between this scientific research and the producer experience, it may just be explained by the smaller scales and shorter timeframes at which scientific research experiments are conducted, as well as the presence of confounding variables such as stocking rate or inflexible management regimes in experiments, which aren't necessarily reflective of what actually happens in these systems. Within the Southern Australian rangelands, there hasn't been many studies that have actually looked at grazing strategy, and so it's hard to draw any conclusive evidence from these. But some studies in the New South Wales rangelands have shown that rotational type systems have increased the cover, biomass and diversity of species present. So what's generally recommended is a tactical grazing management system that's designed to prevent deterioration of the pastures and meet the objectives or requirements of the livestock enterprise. So the tactical grazing systems generally involve setting an objective, for example, increasing the productivity or diversity of the pasture, determining a strategy to then achieve that objective, such as setting utilisation or ground cover thresholds, implementing tactics on a day-to-day basis to be able to respond to the changing conditions and meeting those animal requirements, and lastly, just monitoring to make sure those objectives are being achieved and making adjustments as required. And so in terms of strategies that are available to help manipulate that pasture composition, I've included a few examples here. As we mentioned earlier, the stocking rate or density related to the grazing intensity can have an effect, and the grazing strategy, for example, continuous versus rotational or cell or seasonal grazing systems, for example, and in this changing the length and the frequency of those rest periods to meet the requirements of those desirable species. We can always change the timing of grazing within the year and also employ strategic grazing based on the growth stage of plants. Heavy grazing over the flowering or seeding period to reduce seed production of those undesirable species is an option, or on the other hand, providing rest to allow seeding and establishment of those desirable species. We can provide supplement to encourage a greater intake of those unpalatable species where they might be dominating a pasture, and more intensive interventions such as fire or landscape modification through earthworks can also provide the suitable environment that's required. So that's all I've got time for today. I've included my contact details here if you do want to talk about this any further or get any other information on this. And below here, I've also just included a list of some resources that I find useful for plant identification in Western New South Wales for those that might be interested in looking at that composition of their pastures and understanding the needs of those different species and looking into that further. Thanks a lot.